Tens of thousands of Palestinians forced out of Gaza are slowly beginning their journey home again, carrying their belongings on their backs as they wait at roadblocks. But meanwhile, President Trump has raised the possibility of them not staying there in the future, with Gaza being, in his words, cleaned out. He wants the people there deported to places such as Egypt and Jordan. Speaking on Air Force One, he said, "You are talking about probably 1.5 million people, and we just clean out that whole thing. You know, over the centuries, it's had many, many conflicts, that site, and I don't know, something has to happen." He said this could be long-term or it could be temporary, but Gaza was literally a demolition site and Arab nations should build housing in a different location for its people. Now, his comments have been greeted with horror by the United Nations, by Arab countries and the Palestinian National Authority, but with delight by Israeli settlers and hardline politicians in Tel Aviv who are already encouraging Jewish settlements inside Gaza. But wouldn't deporting the Palestinians from Palestine guarantee the world another 50 years of violence and terror and instability? Let's talk now to Chris Doyle, Director of the Council for Arab-British Understanding. Chris, thank you very much indeed for joining me. And first of all, your reaction to what President Trump has said today.
Well, I think if it had been anybody else but President Trump saying this, we would have just totally ignored it, because in every single respect you can imagine, it's off the charts crazy. And the way that he goes about this, he is treating Palestinians as if they are just like cattle, that they can just be moved from one area to the other. I mean, remember, in Gaza, the 70% of the population were already refugees even before this latest chapter of the conflict erupted, of course, with the Hamas attacks in October 2023. They've been displaced, 90% of them, during the last 15 months, some of them as much as 10 times. And he sort of flippantly comes along and says, well, you know, they can be moved to another country, to Egypt or Jordan. Gaza could be cleaned out. That in itself is just another way in which they're dehumanized. I mean, what we're talking about here, because they don't want to leave, would be ethnic cleansing. It would be forcible deportation. And they've had a history of that. It's not going to be accepted by the Egyptians. It won't be accepted by the Jordanians, the Palestinians, or pretty much anybody else in the region outside of Israel.
Let's just look at those two countries you mentioned there just now, because Egypt doesn't want many more people in because they see that as a source of instability and the regime feels awkward enough already. And Jordan, in many respects, is one huge refugee camp already.
It's always been the long-term position of the Egyptian government that it would have to ward off. It was a red line, in the words of President Sisi, any attempt to push Palestinians out of Gaza into Egypt. And it was prepared to deploy force into the Sinai Peninsula to prevent this. It has said very clearly that this would jeopardize the entire Israel-Egypt peace treaty that was basically signed by the late, brokered by the late Jimmy Carter, of course. That was one of the most important peace agreements that we've had in the Middle East. So Egypt would see it as undermining its security. Also that, like Jordan, it can't afford it. It's in dire economic straits. For Jordan, it's fed up. The people are fed up with being a dumping ground for refugees. It's got over 610,000 Syrian refugees, according to the UN, as well as millions of Palestinian refugees already. So Jordan, one of the most water-scarce countries in the world, can ill afford this. But politically, as was said earlier, it would upset the delicate balance between native East Bank Jordanians and those who actually are Palestinian refugees, who make up about 50% of the population. So Jordan has experienced a conflict on this basis back in 1970, certainly does not want to see any more. And they've been very clear that Palestine should be for the Palestinians, Jordan for Jordanians. So Donald Trump, I think, is a wing and a prayer on all of this.
It does sound like a non-starter, but let me ask you about the politics of the other side of this, which is that it's been welcomed immediately by the right, as it were, the religious right, particularly in Tel Aviv and in Israel more generally. We've seen calls for Palestinians to start to settle North Gaza and, of course, the constant pressure going on the West Bank. What do you think the impact of what President Trump has said is going to be on the Israeli right, as it were?
is going to further excite them. They've already got the sense that Donald Trump is going to allow them to do so much of what they've dreamed. For them, Gaza isn't the epicenter of this conflict. It is the West Bank. For them, that is part of biblical Israel, Judea and Samaria. And they can see that he's going to allow them to annex that area, to expand these illegal settlements. So they really do, that they have this historic opportunity. So the Israeli right has always believed that a solution to Gaza was to dump it onto Egypt, and that the Palestinian state should not be in the West Bank, but it should be in Jordan, that you make Jordan the Palestinian state. This has been their long-term dream. And it's only been in recent years that it's moved from the very, very periphery of Israeli politics to being actually far more in the center, where there is a larger percentage of Israelis who will buy into this. But I would have to say that most Israelis would not. They know that this is not viable. It's just that these extremists are now actually within the Israeli government. They are ministers. So it's become more of a realistic prospect that they're going to support this and back it and encourage Trump to do this. And our understanding is that Trump had this suggested to him by Israeli leaders. This wasn't just done out of the blue.
That is absolutely fascinating. So a really, really good analysis. Thank you so much for joining LBC.